Security, escort this gentleman out, please.
Come on, Soda Pop, let's go.
So I'm Tom Holmes, and I'm a representative from District 14 in Sioux Falls. That's the southeastern part of the city, near John Harris Elementary and Navarre Prince of Peace. And I've been asked to hold on to this microphone, so I assume I'm doing okay so far? Okay. I made some notes too, by the way. Just finishing my first term, I serve on the Education and Health and Human Services committees. And I feel that those are two of the best committees that I could have been placed on simply because I've lived in Sioux Falls since 1971. I came here to teach. I taught at the old Washington High School, I taught at Roosevelt High School, taught social studies. As a matter of fact, a former student asked me to run for office. So education is very important to me. I also am pleased to serve on Health and Human Services because we deal with so many issues on that committee that affect people's lives in very important ways. So those are two very difficult and challenging committees, but two that I feel especially grateful to be serving on. I think if I were to summarize my first term in office, I would compare it to being a newlywed. I didn't really know what I was getting into, but I've learned in a hurry. It's been a real learning experience. I've met some great people, and I've learned a lot about many different things. The learning curve, as one other speaker said, is almost straight up, especially at first, yeah. But it's been a wonderful experience, and I feel privileged to have been a part of the legislative experience. Okay. As a result of that, I've been able to serve on some committees and currently are taking advantage of some opportunities too. Last year about this time, I was asked to serve on an autism work study group, which I did over the summer and into the fall. From that group resulted a piece of legislation whereby therapists will be licensed in the state, and they will be able to work with preschool children who have been diagnosed with autism. It's the first time that has happened here in South Dakota, and it was something I was very pleased and proud to be a part of. States like Minnesota and Wisconsin are well ahead of us in that regard, so we've got some catching up to do, but it's a very important first step. More recently, I was asked to serve on an interagency group that I'm one of the only legislators, I think I am the only legislator on the group. And this group monitors what the state does for children who are born with disabilities. It's birth to 3 years of age. And I'm pleased to be serving on that group as well. And then just last week, I was asked by the Department of Education to serve on a group with superintendents and teachers, those from the department, and I would assume a couple of the legislators. We're going to take what has been written into this new Education Act, which was passed in December, signed into law by President Obama, the Every Student Succeeds Act, and we're going to take what's in that law and see what we have going on here in the state of South Dakota and make sure that they're compatible. So the opportunities continue, even though we're not in session anymore. Those of us who are working are still doing things to try to help people across the state. Okay, now the session itself, I think my colleague in arms here, Steve, would agree with me when I say that it was very historic and also very challenging. But through it all, I've had people tell me, boy, you guys had a tough session. And I said, yes, it was challenging, but that's the way it's supposed to be. We were dealing with some very difficult issues. And it was honestly a privilege to serve the people of South Dakota. Some of the more important bills, at least the ones that I've picked out, and you can ask me what you wish. The most important one, of course, were a series of bills regarding education. Those bills that have been passed into law will provide, as you know, some monies available for teacher salaries, and it will be a continuing source of money for the years to come. It was historic because the last time anything like that had happened here in South Dakota was over 20 years ago. And it was a change that was needed, and we did it. It will also provide monies for mentoring teachers. I know from my own experience as an educator, the first 5 years are the most difficult in many cases, especially if you've moved from one community to another. And so to have a veteran teacher on staff who can help a younger teacher through those difficult times can be very important. In some of our communities, particularly in small isolated towns, it's difficult to find teachers, to attract teachers, so the e-learning is very important for them. Now, if you're not familiar with that, there's an e-learning center in Aberdeen in Northern State University, and there are two different ways that teachers utilize this to help students. I've been up there, so I've been able to see some of this. Matter of fact, they'd even like me to do some teaching through it. We'll see. One way is for a teacher to interact spontaneously in live time with students who are in 4 or 5 different high schools across the state. One lesson I saw was a Spanish lesson, and this teacher had 4 or 5 students in this school, maybe 8 or 10 in this school, and so on, and she was actually teaching the lesson and interacting with them. She had the schools on a screen, and then she was presenting the lesson herself. One other example is where a teacher records a lesson, and then students go home after school or in the evening or on the weekends, and they watch the lesson and do the assignments that way. For some of our students across this state, e-learning is going to be one of the ways that they're going to have to learn if they're going to keep their schools intact. Another important piece of legislation that came down was the transgender bill, which, as you know, was vetoed by the governor, and his veto was upheld. I found it interesting through it all that on the very day the Senate passed 1182, which was the teacher pay bill, Governor Dugard also vetoed the transgender legislation, and guess which story got top billing? Usually as legislators, we don't have much time to watch the news. We're too busy with other things. But that evening, I made a point of watching the news. And the first story up was the transgender bill. After that was oh, by the way, the Senate also passed this. Now, I mention that not because I'm insensitive to transgender students. I'm not. I just felt that the number of students who were being served by the transgender issue were relatively small, when in reality, the education bills affected every public school student across this state. And that, honestly, should have gotten top billing in my mind, but it did not. We also passed legislation dealing with what has been called the Gear Up program. In case you're not familiar with that acronym, it stands for Gaining Early Awareness and Readiness for Undergraduate Programs. What happened in Platte was a tragedy. Terrible, but we have legislation in place now that hopefully will prevent anything like that from happening again. I guess that's all I can say at the present time, because I know there's litigation going on right now. And then finally, one more thing in the area of education. We also passed Senate Bill 159, which gives insurance companies an opportunity to set aside monies into a fund, 80% of which can be used as a tax write-off, and these monies then can be used to finance low-income students going to private schools. Now, I know from my experience here in the Sioux Falls Public Schools, we are getting more and more kids from lower income families, immigrants and such, parents oftentimes who work 1 or 2 jobs to try and get their families to a position where they can stay in their apartments or homes, pay the bills and such. And I remember seeing kids eating lunch on a Friday afternoon, free and reduced lunches, knowing that for some of them, that would be the last time they would have a decent meal until breakfast on Monday morning, once again at school. It was those kinds of kids I was thinking about when we were hearing the debate about whether or not we should be doing this. But that now has become law as well and is in place, and we'll see how many people take advantage of it. It shouldn't impact the schools very much as far as the public schools are concerned. We're talking about a relatively low number of students, but for some kids, going to a smaller school can be just what they need. They need a more nurturing, caring environment, and the public schools, for their part, do an exceptional job. Believe me, they do. The teachers, the counselors, the administrators. But some of our public schools are getting so big, it's easy for kids to fall through the cracks. And so for some of them, going to a smaller school, a private school, may be just what they need to help them learn and to stay in school. Another piece of legislation I think you'll find of interest was a piece that was introduced by Representative Hunt, caring for certain unborn children whose mothers are refugees. They're here legally, but they had no way to care for a child, and so this legislation, which is passed now, will help these children to receive the prenatal care they get, and it will also save us money, because some of these children were being born and had to spend time in NICUs, and I used to volunteer at the NICU at Avera, and I know it could cost upwards of $3,000 a day for a newly born child in a situation like that. So hopefully with this prenatal care, we'll see fewer examples of that happening, and more of these children will be born healthy to mothers who can care for them. We also passed, at least the House did, a dyslexia bill. I understand that failed in the Senate committee. This was a piece of legislation that would have allowed students who've been diagnosed with dyslexia to receive more attention and more counseling that they had previously been getting. Some schools are doing a very good job with this, some not quite so much. But what has been set up is a summer task force, if you will, made up of educators and others to make sure that all the schools across the state are dealing with students who've been diagnosed with dyslexia, seeing that they receive the kind of education they should be receiving. Another piece of legislation that was of interest to me, because we've heard about it for a couple of years, was concerning tanning beds. There was a piece of legislation proposed that would have outlawed the use of tanning beds for anyone under the age of 18. Now, some people claim that the use of tanning beds, especially for a younger person, can be very damaging to their skin, because their skin is still developing, it's still growing, it's particularly harmful to DNA and such. There's evidence to prove that's true. But right now, the Food and Drug Administration is doing testing on that. Today, a matter of fact, is the last day for them to actually take testimony. They are supposed to come down with some sort of a ruling this summer regarding the use of tanning beds. And there were those of us in the legislature who felt that perhaps it would be wise to wait and see what the federal government does, rather than make a law and then perhaps have to go back next year and change it. So hopefully by midsummer we'll know for certain what the dangers are for those who are under the age of 18 using a tanning bed. Another piece of legislation that was of interest was the use of what was called cannabidiol, or CBD. This is a medicine that, I guess I can call it that, it has yet to be approved of by the FDA, but it is a medicine that has been used by some parents who have children with very severe dyslexia, very severe seizures, thank you, to the point where they're getting upwards of 300 a day. And some of these seizures can actually be fatal. So we're talking a very, very severe case here of children with epileptic seizures. Now, there are 39 states that have this law in place already, and the proposal was to put such a law in place here in South Dakota. It failed on the House floor, but I think we're going to be hearing more about this again. What it would have amounted to was a certain amount of THC, or the hallucinogenic part of the marijuana plant, less than 1%, not enough to cause any sort of hallucinogenic issues, nothing like that. But this medicine has been shown in some places to at least reduce the effects of these seizures, if not completely eliminate them. We're talking about a small number of students, really a handful, a small number of children, really just a handful, but for those children and their families, this is very significant. So as I said, the bill failed, but I think we may be hearing more about this in the future. Technically, it's illegal. The law enforcement community asked us not to pass it because it represents a felony, actually 2 felonies. So that certainly impacted on us as well. But the Obama administration has basically turned its back on this. That's why 39 states have laws like this, allowing for it, that they're just simply not enforcing it. The numbers of people involved are pretty small. I mentioned the autism work study group I was a part of. We've succeeded in passing legislation regarding that. And one more, this goes back to veto day here on Tuesday. One of the bills was a cropland being reassessed as non-cropland. And what it amounted to is that farmers could plant grasses and such upwards of 50 feet either side on a river, and then that would be reassessed at a lower level. They wouldn't be paying the property taxes on it that they are now. And there were some issues with that as far as how it would be valued as taxpayers for taxing purposes and that sort of thing, and what exactly represented grasses. Or you could say plant alfalfa in there. Is that a crop, or is that considered something different because that acts like a grass as well? So there were just some issues, and so the governor vetoed it for his own reasons, and the legislature upheld the veto. My own personal vote was in favor. I voted to overturn the governor's veto, actually, because although I recognized there were some problems with the bill, I felt that the gist of it was really good, and particularly those of us living here in Sioux Falls, the Big Sioux River is very polluted, and part of the reason for that is what's happening upstream. The runoff, particularly after a hard rain, the runoff into the Big Sioux from agricultural property is not good. It's toxic, and I think we need to address that. And if there was a problem with the law, I thought we could go back later and fix it. That was my thinking, my thought process. All right, that's as much as I'm prepared to talk about right now. I'd like to open this up for any questions that you have, and I can do my very best to answer them. Yes, sir.
Cannabis bill. You say there was 39 states that have already passed this. Has any kind of a study or review been done on those? Because the big thing on this is it's going to lead to more use of this. That's the number one thing that's hard to watch. Has there been a study done on the 39 states that have this, and has there been any progression towards going from that into full Colorado, Oregon, California?
From what I know, there haven't been any real studies, but neither has it caused any problems like that. Simply because, well, in some states, like Colorado, marijuana is already legal. So there are a few places like that. But no, for the most part, it has not. Because, again, you're dealing with a very small number of people, and they have to order this from other places. The biggest issue they found so far is that, like with anything else, there have been some disreputable people who've gotten involved in this. So the parents have to know who they're dealing with, and there are websites and such they can go to and find reputable, if you want to call them that, reputable people who will provide this medicine for them. But as far as I know, no, it hasn't led to any increased use of marijuana. Other questions?
Are there no other drugs that can have the same impact?
Good question. Phenobarbital, but it has to be taken in such large amounts that it can be very damaging to the child, and it's not always very effective. And what I've suggested to you at this CBD is this is what the parents now are telling us. It has positive effects. In some cases, it eliminates seizures totally, in other cases, significantly. And in a few cases, not at all. I mean, nothing's perfect. But it's better than the medicines that exist at the present time.
I have about 50 years of experience with phenobarbital with a family member. And the doctors now are taking everybody off phenobarbital because it's such a harsh drug for the system. And it's finding that it's doing more damage than it's ever done good. And there's other drugs that they're trying. From my understanding, this THC derivative is probably one of the most natural things that's come along, and so far they haven't been able to find harm to the body. And I kind of wish my sister would be able to take it. I think we could see the last remaining seizures that she has eliminated.
Well, thank you for sharing that. I guess I can tell you as well that according to a parent who was there that day in committee, so the phenobarbital, as you're suggesting, it's actually been harmful to his son's health because it does some brain damage after a time because it's taken in such large amounts. And again, the THC, marijuana is still classified as a class 1 drug. So the government won't even do testing on it at the current time. So it's difficult to get a lot done, but maybe in time that will change. We hope so. You want to do what's best for kids. Perhaps we'll find some sort of an alternative. I don't know. One last thing I'll mention. As far as Medicaid expansion is concerned, Is there going to be a special session? Your guess is as good as mine. We really haven't heard yet. I think the governor's waiting. He'll probably wait till after the primaries. If he wants to call one this summer, he could, or he may just simply wait until after the November elections and deal with it next year. If that happens, that of course will be like the education issue. That'll be a huge thing for us, those of us who are back, to confront. One other issue that's looming on the horizon as well is paying assisted care workers more money, finding a more constant source of income for them. Some of the people who work in our rest homes, our assisted living centers, aren't being compensated very well. There's something like a 50% turnover there. And those people, if you know anything about that, and I would guess you do really the work of God, because they're dealing with individuals who many times now, after a lifetime of service and being productive citizens, are themselves in need of care. And so those people who work with them really are very giving individuals, but they need to be compensated better than they're currently being compensated. And although the legislature found some extra money to contribute to them, it's still not enough. And I think that too will be an issue we'll be hearing about in the next year or two, how to attract people into that profession and then keep them there once they've chosen that as a career. All right. Yes, sir.
Whether the governor calls a special session or proposes Medicaid expansion in the 2017 legislative session, what will be your position on expanding Medicaid?
You know, it's hard to say yes or no without actually seeing a piece of legislation in front of me. What I can tell you right now is this. Having served on Health and Human Services, we had the Department of Health, Department of Social Services talk to us about a lot of different issues, but Medicaid expansion was one of them. Right now, or I should say as of 2015, there was $67 million spent by the state of South Dakota on people between the, on Medicaid, okay? We do provide Medicaid assistance for those under 18 and over 65, but also for some people between ages 18 and 65 who are unable to work. Medicaid expansion, of course, would expand that to include everyone between ages 18 and 65. What we were told is that if that happened, it would save the state a good deal of money, at least $67 million. Much of that care goes for our Native American fellow citizens. They are the fastest growing segment of the South Dakota population. Within 4 to 5 years, that $67 million we're spending could mushroom to over $100 million. So when you look at it from a financial perspective, you've got to look at Medicaid expansion as possibly saving the state some money. Because right now, we're spending a good deal of money on it. It's eating up more and more of our general fund all of the time. And we've got to get a handle on it. If things remain the same, if no changes occur, it's going to continue to take up more of our budget. There are also those people who will argue that it's a humanitarian thing to do. People between the ages of 18 and 65 who are not now currently being covered by Medicaid, 60% of them have jobs. 2/3 of that 60% work full-time. So most of them are currently working. There are those who aren't, but most of them are currently working. They just simply don't work at jobs that provide them health care insurance. So when you hear things like that, it gives you cause to stop and think about, okay, what would this really mean for the state? So would I vote for it? Would I vote against it? I'm not sure. Again, I need to see a piece of legislation in front of me before I really make a final judgment. But what I will tell you is I know there's some good arguments against it. There have been some mistakes made in other states regarding Medicaid expansion. I think our own governor, when you look at his proposal, has taken a very conservative approach. He has overestimated the number of people who would become Medicaid eligible the first and the second year. He's gone well beyond what would be reasonable numbers. He's also not taken into account money that would be saved. He's not included that in any future budgets. I mean, he's taken a very conservative approach that way. But still, there could be some unforeseen consequences that we're not aware of. There might be some other issues that'll come up. But I don't think it's something that you can say right now, yes, I would say I would vote for that or vote against it. Again, I got to see a piece of legislation in front of me. but there are definitely some good arguments on both sides.
There are estimates that it's considerably underestimated the number of people who have come out as well. There are some estimates that run as high as 95,000 instead of 55,000 in those ranges.
Well, right now, we're serving about 117 to 118,000 people. So I'm not sure who's doing those estimates, but in a small state like ours, population is easier to count than, say, a state like Illinois or Ohio. So there are arguments and counter-arguments all the time. Yes, ma'am.
Wasn't that affordable to make affordable in different programs to those people?
I don't think that applied to people who fell below the poverty level. I don't think that applied to the people we're talking about here with Medicaid expansion, no.
Okay, so there would be another medical, like a certain medical situation that they would have to qualify.
Well, their income would have to fall below the poverty level to qualify for Medicaid expansion.
I'm probably not explaining that question. I know it's a lot more complicated than I understand. But where exactly is the cutoff then about here? How much would a person, like let's say a person wasn't making very much money, but they were working full time? Because I know I have a girlfriend who's working at Little Scrubs, and she pays, I think, $200 a month.
Yeah, I don't know. I can't comment on that.
I'm not sure exactly. So basically, is it a money thing, or is it more of a medical issue that they were going with?
Are you talking about Medicaid expansion now?
Yes.
Well, they'd have to fall below the poverty line to qualify in the first place. And then from there, I don't know how else to answer that. They have to fall below the poverty line. It's the best thing I can say.
So Obamacare was really geared for people above. Is that right?
I think that would be safe to say, yeah. So everybody had health care insurance who could pay for it, at least part of it, yeah. But we're talking about poor people, we talk about Medicaid expansion. And by the way, this is something that's not just recent. What it really boils down to is that in our state, the federal government was required, based on treaties out of the 1800s, to take care of Native American peoples. And they really haven't done the job in doing that. Governor Janklow was the first governor to try and hold the federal government accountable, and he was basically pushed aside. Governor Rounds, now Senator Rounds, when he was the governor, he actually sued the federal government, but lost in circuit court. What has changed now, and by the way, Governor Dugard started work on this some 6-7 years ago. And there are people in the legislature who have traveled to Washington, D.C., met with people in the Department of the Interior and such, and nothing has happened until the last year or so. And people talk about how this would be a kind of a nice thing for Obama to have, to get a red state like South Dakota to expand Medicaid. For us, it's a financial situation, because you have many people, many Native American people, who are being paid for, at least in part, by the state of South Dakota for their medical expenses. You've got 5% of the people taking up 85% of the Medicaid budget right now. And many, not all, but many of those people would be taken under the wing of the federal government and paid for. And that's where the savings would come in. And so Governor Dugard, has requested that the federal government come back with certain answers, which the federal government has done. And it came too late in the session for us to do anything. But they've responded in a way which the governor's office has found agreeable. So he's now looking to see if we should take the next step, and he wants to come to the legislature. He wouldn't have to. He could simply, because it's a program that's already in place, he could simply say we are going to do this. But he has stated that he wants legislative approval before we expand anything like this.
I do have another question on the gender situation. I was at one of the legislative conferences with parents, and a couple of the council people said that they were asking their children who were going to school how it would affect them, and their answer was, well, we think that they should be able to do whatever they want to do. I really don't understand how that could, and then, so then, what they were saying is, we are sort of backing up our children on this. I think isn't that a more difficult situation than to ask somebody like in middle school if it was going to bother them or not? They're very, at that age too, they're very impressionable.
Are you talking about the transgender issue?
Yes.
Okay. Well, the proposal, as you know, was to set up separate facilities. And yeah, there were some students who were, kids, like you're saying, kids that age, want to be cool, they want to be accepted. They'll say whatever, sometimes say what's outrageous just to get our reaction as adults. That's pretty typical. I can't really answer your question specifically because I don't know the families. What I can tell you is that as a legislator from Sioux Falls, the Sioux Falls Public School District took the position of neutral with no explanation. So there was no direction, anything given to us. On a lot of other issues, of course, they were quite vocal. I found out later, actually after the vote, that the Sioux Falls schools were doing things in the middle schools and high schools to deal with this issue. I wish they would have told us that in early February. Because if they were already dealing with it, maybe it's something we should have just let them deal with, as they're having to do right now. Now, as far as the kids go, I remember a news story I did see where some students at Lincoln High School were being interviewed. And of course, the 3 or 4 students they interviewed were all in favor of what actually has happened. There were other students, however, the comment was made, that did not want to be interviewed. And I'm wondering if those students were opposed to it but were afraid to say so on camera. I think you do get that side as well, because they don't want to be ostracized. They don't want to be have to deal with any sort of guff coming from any of their fellow students too. You get that kind of criticism in a school. So I think there were students who were probably opposed to it but were afraid to say anything, at least publicly.
How do you think the issue will come back in the next session?
The transgender issue? Well, the prime sponsor of that bill is not running again. Mr. Deutsch, yeah. He has a very lucrative chiropractic practice, and he and his wife do that, and she was asking that he not run again. So I don't know if it'll come back. My own sense right now is no, because I think we're just going to wait and see what the schools are doing, and if there's an issue, they'll let us know, and then maybe we'll deal something. But as long as the schools have chosen to deal with this in their own way, I think we'll just let that play out, quite honestly. That's my feeling.
Any other questions? Any other questions? All right, I want to thank you very much. for your
Thank
time.
you.
Y'all come back now. Cheers.
What kind of morons run this outfit?